Hi, my name is Melanie Bernhofer, and I am heading the program for climate, trade and agricultural policy at the EU office of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. You're listening to the Böll Europe podcast. In case you're listening to us for the first time, we're the German Green political foundation affiliated with the German political party Alliance 90, the Greens. Our EU office in Brussels represents the foundation vis-à-vis European and international institutions, associations, non-governmental organizations, and media based in Brussels. Find out more about our work on our website eu.böll.org. Today on the Böll Europe podcast, we explore the often overlooked link between international climate politics and gender perspectives. We will discuss how climate change impacts women and marginalized communities, the inclusion of gender in global initiatives, and the crucial role of intersectional feminism in climate justice. We'll also examine the urgent measures governments should take in the super election year. Stay tuned for a conversation with our guest, Sofia Szewczuk. Joining us today is Sofia Szewczuk, a Brussels-based expert on environment, gender, peace, and security policy. She's the co-founder of The Tide, an NGO that aims at building a community to find creative and innovative solutions to environmental challenges, gender inequality, and global insecurities. And Sofia is also hosting the podcast Vonna Talks that is dedicated to these issues. Welcome, Sofia.
Thank you for inviting me and looking forward to our conversation.
Let's start with the impacts of climate change on women and marginalized groups. Sofia, what unique challenges do they face in climate adaptation and mitigation efforts?
I think I would want to start with basically just sharing that women do face greater and more severe impacts from climate change, women and marginalized groups. And I think this is also often when I introduce myself on what do I do and where do I go and which fields I work in, people are like, but what's the connection between all of those things? So the connection I feel like is still a bit overlooked, but I will try to go a bit into some examples and maybe statistics to already show what's the connection between women, gender, security, climate change, and why women are harshly and harsher affected by climate change. So yeah, it probably won't be too much of the news if I tell you that women often face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change, especially due to their existing roles, responsibilities, and cultural norms where they live. We also know that majority of women or more women live in poverty if we compare that with the statistics on men. For example, in many societies, women are still responsible for household energy, food, water, care for younger and also for the elderly. And if we look at the global statistics, we can also see that women and girls represent around 80% of the world's displaced population through climate change disaster and changes, according to the UN data. This is all very global statistics and global data. But if we want to bring it a bit closer to Europe, which I also usually try to do, because often if I talk about these topics, we tend to see that the problem is somewhere out there in global south countries or somewhere else. But it actually is already something that is happening probably in our neighborhoods. Besides the fact that we see that the temperatures are rising already in Europe and they're rising twice as fast as the global average, we are experiencing heat waves. And I think most of you probably will relate to this. But unfortunately, we also observe that women are more exposed to heat rather than men. Unfortunately, the data, because you also asked me about women and marginalized communities, the data is not there to confirm all the facts on how, based on different identity intersectionality norms, migrant women or women of color or elderly versus young women, how much they are affected by this. So we still have a huge data gap on that matter. But we can already see that more and more women report cases of suffering and even mortality in some cases due to heat waves. Across the world, women also depend more on natural resources. And in many regions, women bear a disproportionate responsibility to secure food, to secure water, to secure fuel. Women are also more represented in the agriculture sector. So all the effects of climate change that are happening in our communities, they affect primarily the people who are at the front line, who are providing services and working in the fields that are mostly affected by climate change, especially if we talk about lower and lower middle income countries. And during the periods of droughts or vice versa, rainfalls, women and agriculture workers are basically the first ones to get affected. I also wanted maybe to mention that in addition to women being affected by climate change, they're also the ones who bring solutions and who are the main actors. And I remember myself when I started working in the topic, I think roughly 5 or 6 years ago, I read a book by Mary Robinson on climate change and women who are leading kind of movements in climate change. And that book was very, very inspiring. It's very easy to read. It's basically stories of different women who were unfortunately the most affected by climate change, but who kind of took the situation in their hands and started doing something about it, from smaller actions at the community levels and then kind of growing and being represented at the global levels. And we kind of also see that many more women are becoming part of the solutions. They care more when they vote. They care more. And I know that we're going to talk a bit about voting later on. When they vote, when they make their conscious decisions about where to go, what to purchase, which projects to invest in, and so on. Women do care about climate change and those social aspects a little bit more. This is not to say that just because women are caring and so on and so forth, but it is the reality as well. And I think it's also very important to highlight that often those people who are mostly affected need to do the burden of doing the work and bringing the solutions as well.
Thank you for this great insight. It's actually very interesting that you're mentioning that the main actors for solutions to climate change are also women, which actually brings me to my next question. How are global initiatives integrating the gender perspectives already? Are there any examples that you can share where you see that gender equality is mentioned in global initiatives or this challenge is tackled?
To start answering this question, I would first want to mention that I'm still a bit skeptical, and I think that there is still not enough work being done at the global level, from funding part to mentions to concrete projects and ideas, because climate change, I mean, it is a very huge and global challenge, but it also has a lot of smaller effects that it has on smaller communities. And I think that's what makes it the hardest for global initiatives to kind of really trickle down and do help those on the ground. But I think we still need to highlight that the global actions do matter. And if we do not see them and if we do not have them, and like starting from basic things of even recognizing climate change with the Paris Agreement and so on, it did have a lot of spillover effects at the national and local levels later on. So this global recognition still matters. But I think with climate change, we really need to be careful with not just kind of overlooking the things that need to be still done. And we often have this thing, even at the EU level and more globally, that we try to like, okay, we already did this and that, let's move on and let's do something else. We already did a lot for climate change. Like it's something that, unfortunately, I feel like our generation would have to learn how to live with. And this would become just something that we need to constantly check in with and try to see what else can be done, what more can we do, because it's not just something that we are like, okay, done deal and moving forward. Yet I still feel gender and climate is something that is a relatively new area. So if we look at the global level, and the most recent, the biggest example probably would be the UNFCCC, the COP conferences. And we know that in 2012 was actually the first year when gender dimension of climate change has been addressed at the COP meeting, which to me is a little bit too late already, but better late than never. And then I know that it's been already, I think, for 2 years that at COP we already are having the Gender Day. So it's a day when they highlight different gender dimensions and perspectives and projects, climate policies, best practices, various strategies and financial parts in recognizing women's roles and gender dimension in climate change. So that has been happening only for 2 days. And here you also, if you talk to gender as experts, I think we all have different views in terms of, on the one hand, it's nice that Gender Day exists there. On the other hand, it kind of puts everything related to gender in the Gender Day, and then everyone else discusses different other things during the other days, where gender probably is not the biggest priority and dimension. And I also often see it from the work that I do. If you do gender, they just put you on a gender panel, or they will put you in a gender room, and this is where you discuss these things, instead of recognizing that gender actually is more than just women's issue. I mean, if we really go into details, it's not only about women. It often is about women, but not only. So to me, I'm still being a little bit skeptical as to what extent COP or UNFCCC or even any other global initiatives do tackle gender at the level that we would say, okay, this is enough to provide enough space and recognition, so then the issue could spill over or trickle down to local and national levels. And actually, a concrete example of why it didn't trickle down yet, if we look at the nationally determined contribution, or NDCs, we can see that gender considerations are still less integrated into long-term low-emission development strategies. So if we really go into what countries concretely want to do at the national level to basically tackle climate change issues, we see that the gender dimension is still very much overlooked there, which probably also confirms that at the global level, it's still not done enough. I mean, we also know that gender probably is a speculative term for some governments. So if we even go into intersectionality of it, then it's even worse to see there.
It's interesting that you're mentioning intersectionality. Can you go into this a little bit more and explain it in more depth, and how it might be relevant to integrating a gender perspective, or gender and beyond, in climate change negotiations, for example?
I think that actually climate change might be one of the best fields to see why intersectionality matters. And I think this is also what you were asking me a little bit there. And that's why when I started working, I recognized that I need to have an intersectional approach in the work that I do, because, okay, we can go and try to provide solutions and find the challenges that women face. But then if we go deeper, we see that, okay, women are also not homogeneous group. We can see that there are different examples there. And then climate change is something that affects all of us. So there is no really one person who's going to stand alone and not suffer from it. And by providing solutions only to one certain group, or just solutions for women and men, we're tending, or we have a threat to overlook many, many other people on the planet who probably will suffer, and for whom we might need to keep finding out new solutions if it's not yet too late. So it's from a very personal perspective, which I feel like intersectionality is really very visible in climate change, the importance of it. And therefore, we need to start from the beginning right now when we do the research, when we do the data disaggregation, when we try to look what are the challenges, we already from the beginning need to have this kind of intersectional feminism lens towards how we look at the problem and how we look at the solutions as well. It is clear that climate change risks to kind of affect the indigenous people, also more younger women, LGBTIQ representatives, women with disabilities, migrant women, those who live in rural or remote areas, in conflict-affected areas. So the effects of climate change would be very, very different. And this data, as I said, we do not really have just yet. So I think we have to be very cautious into how we do the research and how we would present the solutions. And then actually there is already a feminist climate justice report by the UN Women, which I do invite you to read. I think it's quite recent, and they do provide some sort of principles and schemes and framework on what is actually feminist climate justice, which I think is a good phrase to start with. They also look, because we know that in feminism we have this 3R: representation, resources, and rights. In feminism we have the 3Rs: rights, representation, and resources. And then the feminist climate justice kind of presents a little bit similar but also different. So they have the redistribution of resources, land, public finance, then the recognition recognition of basically the data that I was telling about right now, the recognition that climate change does affect everyone differently, recognition of the unpaid labor that women do, other marginalized communities, and then recognition of indigenous communities and their knowledge and their practices that they have been actually practicing for a very long time already. Then it also leads to representation, so representation of women, marginalized communities, and we often actually tend to overlook, I feel like, or pay too much attention on the representation issue and not look at the other parts. But I feel like representation still does matter, and this might be the first step to at least invite people in, provide them with space and opportunity to speak, share their examples, and at least start doing some actions there. So this part is also still represented in the feminist climate justice framework. And then the reparations, which also I know is a bit of a controversial phrase, but unfortunately with climate change, we see that right now those who suffer the most from climate change are the ones who contributed the least to the whole problem. So unfortunately, the countries would have to recognize the burden that they have created in the world. And here I mean the global north countries would have to contribute more financially, resource-wise, redistribute the resources in order to make sure that we at least get to the balance. It's not even to the development, but at least making sure that other people and other communities can survive in the current world with climate change threats. Yeah, so for all of this, I feel and that we need the intersectional approach and not to exacerbate the existing inequalities and existing challenges that we already have. Because for now, climate change just creates this kind of a threat multiplier to the existing discriminations that many people already have been facing for years and decades.
Thank you so much for this insight. I wanted to quickly come back to the challenges that you're seeing when it comes to global initiatives, but also European or local initiatives as well. You have mentioned the data gap and funding issues. Do you see any other challenges that we have to tackle and overcome in order to tackle those challenges?
Something that I work, and here it's going to be a very personal view, I think, because I feel like it starts from people. It starts from myself. I have not been an expert on climate change. This is not what I studied. I'm actually a security and international relations expert. And I always thought that climate change is something that people who are experts on this, they're going to tackle it and they're going to provide solutions and I will do my job. And I understand those people who think the same. But unfortunately, I also happen to recognize that we live in the world, as I was already saying, where we cannot, like climate change is not just yet another problem. Like it has really affected all of us so much that we would have to become, to a certain extent, experts on climate change and try to apply the practices that bring the solution, or at least limit the challenge and the threat in our daily lives. So I think this is where I would say that this is the first step where we need to look into education about climate change, into educating about the real facts, because we also have a lot of greenwashing right now happening around us. I'm myself a victim of a lot of greenwashing just because there is just so much of information out there that it's really hard to fact check everything what you see, from the products you buy to businesses you invest in or companies you want to work with. And since we are living also in a very busy and fast, rapid environment, it's hard for us to kind of be sure that we double check everything. So I feel like education is the first part, to just know the basics, which will help you at the personal level to already take better decisions. The other part, I mean, I also try to have this gender and climate lens in every work that I do and everywhere where I go. And it might be a bit of challenging and burdening sometimes, even in your daily practices, to be this person in the room who would constantly point out that something is not okay here or something is wrong. Or if you talk too much about climate, why no one talks about gender part in there? Or if you talk about gender, why no one tackles the climate things? Because I think we cannot really afford anymore to just sort those issues as a standalone issue, because they are not. Like it's a huge system change that needs to happen. And for that, we really need to recognize who are the ones who suffer the most, who are the ones who need to help the solutions, and where do we look at the structure that does not work. So the small challenges, like with the data gap, I think it's a longer term and we need the data. With funding, we need basically right now already, because the climate change issues and challenges, they keep happening as we speak, and the finances are not there. So we already see quite a lot of communities basically probably disappearing from this planet just because there is not enough resources to help them. But we also need to look at the long term on how are we going to basically change that. It's not just whenever something happened, then we come and we help, but how can we prevent things from happening, and how we can ensure that the system works in a way that this money just keeps coming and those who are the most responsible keep funding, because for now it's also still a lot of burden on governments. And when I attend all those climate change conferences and I hear about different pledges and different things, I know governments need to start, but we know that governments will never have probably that money that we need today. So we also would need to start collaborating with business, with private sector and other communities that probably are still not that much engaged in the conversations when it comes to funding, and often are also absent from different conversations. And I understand why. We still discuss climate change, gender in very big silos. And I think this is also what we, with the Tide and the organization that we just founded, that we will try to look at least at the Brussels and Belgium level to start with, and then hopefully have some a bit global, bigger initiatives that we just start talking to each other, because there is just so much pain and there is so much hatredness and so much misunderstanding between different people who are affected and different interests. But I think those things could be solved if we start looking at the personal level, at the educational part, and then start talking to each other and start discussing, okay, how do we actually manage to survive as humanity and as a planet, and how do we build the future that would work for all of us? An interesting thing, because we talk a lot about challenges, and I do not know if solutions part is coming, but there are already a lot of solutions out there. If you really go into different conferences and if you talk to people, and I mentioned already the indigenous knowledge, so many solutions are already out there. So I think on solutions part, we're actually doing quite good. They just need a bit more attention and more funding resources to kind of actually start trying them out and start applying them in our real lives, which is also something positive, because I saw that maybe we still need to figure out what works, what doesn't work, because we're still not aware of all the effects of climate change and how is it going to affect us. But despite that, the solutions could already be out there. And so just start educating yourself. I think this could be a good way to begin from.
Absolutely. Climate change is something that affects all of us, which is why it's so important that we all know about what is going on, and learn also how we can do our part to tackle this challenge. You mentioned your newly founded NGO, The Tide, and I've noticed that you're not only looking at the intersection between gender and climate, but you're also looking at security. And with your background in security policy, I wanted to ask you, how is security playing a role in all of this?
Yeah, I think if I add the security part, then for sure, usually I lose some people, or actually maybe even gain some people, because the idea was to work on the intersection between climate, gender, security, also to get those who work in international relations, security, or a bit more militarized type of environments, to get their attention to these topics. And it depends who I talk to, how do I present the topic. But two concrete examples on how climate change, gender inequality, and security connect between themselves. Again, I will provide one on Global South, and then one that is a bit closer to us. So we know that in many communities, as I already was mentioning, women are responsible for basic needs like water and food. And when it comes to water, with climate change and with many more droughts, women have to walk longer distances to provide water for their families and their communities. And by walking longer distances, women are either affected already by some threats and insecurities that they might face in the spaces where they haven't been before, or by returning home and taking longer time to provide water, they also face some domestic violence challenges, indeed, because of the cultural norms. So this is one of the kind of very concrete and very community-based example of how climate change, gender, and security, to me at least, connect. Of course, we can go a bit more global, that climate change is a threat multiplier, and the migration part that I also already was talking about. But at least the way I try to look at it is at the very personal and community level. And unfortunately, again, there is no statistics on how many women suffered from domestic violence due to climate change and droughts and flooding, maybe. But we probably, by presenting it at the very community level, and those who work with those communities, they probably would know that this is unfortunately a frequent case. And then when it comes to Europe, I was at the conference between the European mayors, and there was one woman who is a deputy mayor, I think, of Budapest, who mentioned the story that after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when Europe was trying to reduce the energy dependency, and basically it kind of had a consequence that we had an energy cuts. And one of the ways to save a bit of energy and electricity was to reduce the street lights in European cities, which seemed like a very logical decision because who needs the lights at night? But those people who need the lights at night are women. And also because, I mean, we live in Brussels and we know how Brussels streets are far from being the safest ones. And this, unfortunately, are the cases for many European cities. And these are also some of the things where if we do not have data, if we do not know why the street lights are needed and who they actually make feel safer, we will be doing the climate change solutions or energy saving solutions that in the end provide more threats to women or marginalized communities. So these are just very, very concrete examples. But we also see that climate change drives conflicts across the world, and then women who already have been facing gender-based violence, conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, child marriage, they basically will be suffering even more, and we will see more and more cases like that. So therefore, when I started working in those fields, I understood that we just cannot, like I cannot just drop one thing and work on another thing. And sometimes even if I work on a project that is purely climate change related, I always try to see the intersection with other parts that I know, that I'm aware of. And I think this is also how we need to start making our brain work, because the triple nexus will not appear in each and every case. And it's not going to be the case that we all become the experts on the nexus. But at least applying this lens in the solutions and in the challenges, and at least at the initial part, just to know, like, for instance, I know at the EU level in CSDP missions, they have a gender sensitive analysis, on climate change sensitive analysis, and those things only start to happen, but they really need to be more spilled over across all different projects, just so we do not provide more threats and more challenges to already very many existing ones.
Absolutely agree. You also mentioned the keyword awareness and being aware what's happening around us, and also being aware of the different nexus that we have. You mentioned challenges like migration and climate change, or security and climate change. When it comes to the solutions, what do you see is already being implemented? What do you see is already successful? And do you have any ideas, or at your organization, The Tide, have you already seen solutions that could be implemented at European level, at local level? I'd be interested to hear about that.
Well, I feel like I will stay away from providing concrete solutions, just because the topic is just very vast, and it very much depends on which concrete idea you look at and where are you an expert, whether it's a local level or a bit more global level. But I will focus on kind of frameworks and spaces that provide those solutions. So we do know that the solutions to climate change are still a community-driven field and community-driven kind of idea of looking into that. It's still not something that many businesses or even governments would look into if not for people. So we see that if we take example of the European Union, the Green Deal, and everything that kind of went out of the Green Deal has been the consequences of the fact that young people were protesting and trying to fight for climate change issue. And this has been one of the biggest probably successes, where kind of democracy showed that it is working. And this was a response. We also see it at many local levels as well, like for instance in Poland, the country that recently had elections, or relatively recently, basically last autumn. And before, we could see that Poland was a country that was challenging when it comes to climate change discussions. So right now not to say that climate change was the only topic that led to the change of government in Poland. There were many other things. But this was one of the cases where the new government kind of started to step in, and climate change is becoming more of a topic where people are getting more awareness and trying to see how they can be part of the conversation and solutions, considering some national perspectives and how the country is basically being run through, and the historical part of why climate change can be a challenging topic. So this to say is that all those protests, because I myself has been a little bit skeptical at some parts, maybe because I'm Ukrainian, and in Ukraine we do love to protest, and not all of those protests led to something better later on. It does work differently in Europe, thankfully, so we have that privilege where actually the voices of the people do matter, and I think it's especially important right now before the EU elections that are coming up. I myself cannot vote, but I will try to raise as much awareness as possible to ensure when people do make their choices that they really do look at the programs and look at the things that are important. If you again ask about solutions, it's very easy to fall in the burden that, oh, it's the government to blame, or it's the businesses to blame, or it's the bigger countries, or in the solutions like I'm not going to drink a paper cup coffee or not use plastic forks, which please do that. But unfortunately, this is not going to help the climate change if we really look at the global level. So it's really looking at the things of what actually can make a difference and what actually can bring some solutions and have an effect. And with that, we just basically use our democracy tools. So the first and the nearest one is the elections. Go and vote. Think who you are voting for. I cannot affect or influence different parties, but also the polls are not looking that nice. And we still see that climate change is considered one of the biggest issues, but unfortunately with the economic crisis, energy crisis, many more conflicts and security issues that are appearing in the world, I feel like the climate change kind of is stepping aside as not the biggest priority, which unfortunately is also not that good for us, because if we just stop doing climate change or provide some solutions for a year or two to sort the security issues, it might be already too late for, as I was saying before, for some communities and some parts of the world. So, yeah, when it comes to solutions, your voice matters. Maybe very, very naive way, but there are many confirmations to that. And I would actually really focus at the community solutions, because we often try to look at, and I think those who do decide the global politics, that they do have an idea, and it's a bit harder to kind of reach the voices out there, even if we sit in Brussels. But I think if everyone is going to start doing their parts at the local community levels, looking at the trees that are being cut outside of your home, that might seem, oh, just one tree, but it actually might have a global and a more effect for what's happening around you and how your community can be part of the solution as well.
So we need solutions at all level, community, but also political level, of course. Given that we're in a super election year this year, with national elections in 64 countries, plus the EU election that you have already mentioned, would you say that this is a pivotal moment that we're currently in?
We surely are in a pivotal moment, in a bit scary moment, I would say as well, for many of us, because there is just a lot of pressure happening around the world, a lot of information, as I was saying already, and a lot of misinformation and disinformation, which makes it a little bit scary, I think, for many experts and for those who read the news. It's a lot and it's very overwhelming. But I think that this is also a time to actually understand what you actually truly care about and what you want to vote for and what you want to see in the world in future. Maybe even read the news a little bit less. And this is also something that I do, unfortunately, even though I'm an expert and this is my job to follow all of the things, but maybe do read the sources that you truly trust, do your research. It requires I feel like this year and many years requires us extra attention and engagement. Like we cannot afford anymore to just follow what everyone tells us and to agree on whatever is happening around us. So this is, again, at some very, very personal level. But if you look at all those negative news, like in my case, at least, they stimulate me to do more. They stimulate me to see that it's not a done deal yet. Democracy cannot be taken for granted. Security and peace cannot be taken for granted. And I want to be part of the solution and not part of those who follow some challenges and problems that were created before me or not including me and my voice. And when it comes to climate change, I do not know if I need to still tell, like, we need climate action now. If we look at the data, most likely we are already about 1.5 degrees, and the temperature rising is not the only issue of the environmental challenges that we discussed. There is a huge biodiversity loss. There is many other challenges that are happening around us. And current governments, if they are in place for the next 5 years, the next 5 years are going to be critical. So if we still want to change, and I don't want to finish it on the negative side and on a negative side, but unfortunately the next 5 years are going to be the most crucial ones. And it might be the last years when we actually still can start applying some of the policies and solutions that have to start happening. Because if not, in 5 years, it will already be too late to start doing something. So whatever needs to happen will be happening right now with the current governments that we elect this year, which I think it does put the pressure. It is a lot of pressure on us. But I still am hopeful. I guess I have to be. I do believe that humanity and people are good and they truly want better for the planet. It's just we kind of have been a little bit lost in a lot of information and a lot of other things that are happening around us. And it's kind of a bit reconnecting to yourself and to what truly matters.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sophia. That was a very insightful discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Böll-Europe podcast. A big thanks to our guest, Sophia Szewczuk, for sharing her expertise and inspiring us with her work at The Tide and Vonna Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. Check out the show notes and our website for more related content, eu.böll.org. Among our most recent content, you'll find a web dossier on the EP 2024 elections, featuring insights from the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung's offices and partners on the EP elections, the next EU legislative term, and the super election year 2024. If you want to learn more about the intersection of climate and gender, check out the publication Why the European Green Deal Needs Ecofeminism by the European Environmental Bureau and Women Engage for a Common Future. Check out also the report Women CSO Leaders for Systemic Change, which we published with the Green European Foundation, the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Until the next episode, goodbye.